I know I said that we were going to be discussing the Powder River gold strike and the situation with the Lakotas there. But before we do that, actually, I want to circle back around because there's still several Civil War topics that I want to discuss, particularly Civil War in the West. And we're going to start by taking a look again at Indian Territory. Now, we discussed in lecture video number 28 Indian removal, the arrival of the five quote unquote civilized tribes in eastern Oklahoma, and the difficulties that they had there, as well as the fact that by the 1850s the Indian Territory was entering a golden age. There was peace once more, and the indigenous people who had been removed there now able to think about growing their food, trading, engaging in business. However, the Civil War is going to be disruptive of that, just like it was in the rest of the country. So here we have a map of Indian Territory circa 1860, and this is essentially Oklahoma without the panhandle. And you can see where the various tribes were located. We've talked about this before, I know, but just a reminder, the Cherokee Nation in the northeastern corner of what's now Oklahoma, the Creeks south and west of them, the Seminoles are directly south of the Creeks, and then the Choctaws in the southeast, and the Chickasaws just west of them. And you can see these other things that say leased from the Cherokee Nation, leased from the Chickasaw or Choctaw nations. Those lands were part of the holdings of the Cherokees and the Choctaws slash Chickasaws, which they did not actually occupy at this time. This is the western end of the state, prairie, and actually the tribal governments had been for some time leasing that land to Anglo ranchers, essentially. But this is the area that we're talking about. Now, notice in this map the fact that there are several forts in Indian Territory, U.S. Army forts. You've got Fort Gibson, Fort Towson, Fort Washita, Fort Arbuckle, Fort Cobb. These forts were part of the agreement for Indian removal back in the 1830s. The federal government had promised those tribes that after being removed to Indian Territory, which was already occupied by other tribes, that the federal government would have forts built there, forts that were already in existence. Fort Smith was revived, for instance, for a while before it just became the town of Fort Smith. But particularly to be there to protect the Cherokees and the Creeks and the Choctaws and so forth from the quote unquote wild Indians to the west in western what is now Oklahoma. So when the Civil War started, these forts, they were already manned by federal troops. Take a look at where these forts are located. You've got Kansas up to the north. It's a pretty good ways off from them, though, from most of them. And the rest of the area there, you've got Arkansas due east, and Texas across the river, across the Red River. So as you're probably aware, Arkansas and Texas seceded from the Union and joined the Confederacy. So these forts, they're kind of stretched out there beyond easily supplied supply lines that are going to be cut off now. And so those soldiers were in kind of a a difficult situation and their commanders. So what they did was they abandoned those forts, and those Union troops, those federal troops, were pulled back northward to Kansas so that they wouldn't be overwhelmed by the new Confederate Army. So we're talking 1861 at this point, spring of 1861. So that's an important thing to bear in mind. The forts were abandoned. And that's where these two guys come in. Both of them brigadier generals in the newly constituted Confederate Army. President Jefferson Davis of the Confederacy sent Albert Pike to Indian Territory to meet with the leadership of various tribes. He was supported by a detachment, a group of Texas troops commanded by Brigadier General Ben McCulloch of Texas. So let's take a look at these two guys first. Both of them pretty significant in Western history. Pike was a lawyer, also an amateur poet. He had been practicing law in Arkansas, and in fact, he had been the attorney for the Creek Nation in the 1850s in efforts to get the courts to return some of the at least some of the promised, give some of the promised funds, or expand the amount of promised funds that the federal government was giving to the Creeks. So he represented the Creeks in court. He knew the Creek leadership very well. He was familiar with the culture of the Creek tribe and the other tribes. So he seemed like a good choice to send on this mission to try to get the leaders of various tribes to sign treaties with the Confederate States of America. General McCulloch, Ben McCulloch, originally from Tennessee by way of Texas, was a pretty relevant figure in early Texas history. He had been one of the more famous Texas Ranger captains. He had also served in the Texas legislature. So that's how he winds up being noteworthy enough for me to talk about a little bit. But basically, this is going to be the Albert Pike show. By the way, what Albert Pike is most famous for today, and actually was most famous for even then, is his association with the secret society known as the Freemasons. And by association, I mean the fact that basically he was the leader of the Freemasons for decades. In fact, he already had been for a couple of years at the time of this diplomatic mission that he goes on. So there's a picture of him on the right, later in life, in all of his Freemasonry finery. There are chapters and memorials to him around the country, including one in downtown Knoxville, that usually focus more on his association with Freemasons than on his service in the Confederate Army, which, to be perfectly honest, really, when it came to military actions, Pike, Brigadier General Albert Pike, was not that noteworthy, really. We may get into that a little bit. But so far as the diplomatic mission to the native tribes, Generals Pike and McCulloch met with actually the leadership, with the tribal councils of several different groups, including several of the groups to the west, and I'm talking about Western Indian Territory / Oklahoma, into the Texas Panhandle, tribes that were referred to at the time usually as quote unquote wild tribes, compared to the quote unquote civilized five tribes. We're talking about groups like the Comanches in particular, the Wichitas, also Caddos, and several others. And essentially the treaties that Pike negotiated with those tribes were non-aggression treaties or treaties of neutrality. So essentially, the Confederacy is saying to the Comanches, let's say, we got a war going on here. And so during this time, we promise not to attack you if you will promise not to attack us. So we will just, stay out of each other's business so that we can participate in this war that we have to get around to. Now, were these treaties effective? Some were, and some definitely were not. But that's really not what we're talking about right now. Let's look though at Pike and his goals and his approaches in eastern Oklahoma with the 5 civilized tribes. Now, among the people of those 5 tribes, there was a whole spectrum, there was a whole range of thought regarding how they felt about this civil war that was starting between the North and the South. And I say it's a spectrum. On one end of that spectrum, most Choctaws and Chickasaws were very much in favor of the Confederacy winning this war. In fact, there are records of Choctaw and Chickasaw leaders telling people, hey, if the Union wins this war, they're going to come take away our slaves. Um, North of them, the Seminoles, they were on the opposite end of the range. Um, Probably at least half, probably much more than half of the Seminoles were in support of the Union or the United States. And then with the people of the Cherokee and Creek nations, they were divided almost down the middle as to which side they wanted to win and which side that they identified with and wanted to support. And how that division worked out was in many ways dependent on things that had happened 30 years earlier. So essentially, among the Cherokees and also among the Creeks, those individuals and their families who had been willing in the 1830s to sign away their land and voluntarily move west, well, they were more likely to support the Confederacy. And the ones who had not wanted to sign any treaties, had not wanted to give their land away, had not wanted to be removed, and had resisted the idea of it, they were more likely to favor the Union here in the Civil War. This division, like among the Cherokees, it would essentially, you could call it the Nationalist Party versus the Treaty Party. You could call it the John Ross faction as opposed to the Ridge faction. But whichever way you looked at it, and again, this is not 100% true across the board, but generally speaking, those folks who had been most willing to sign away their lands and take new lands in the West were modernists who were more, I guess, inclined to adapt and to sort of change their way of doing things to better match their white neighbors. In many cases, they were also, as a result of that, the ones that were most invested in plantation slavery. Although, like I said, that was not across the board. There were people on the other side who owned slaves as well. But that's one factor. Were you a modernist, and did you therefore think of, let's say, your people as the Cherokee Nation, not as a geographic area, but as a political idea? Then you're more willing to side with the Confederacy because, like I said, there's more investment in slavery. There was more sympathy for the Southern way of life among many of those folks. Whereas those who were traditionalists and who had not wanted to be removed and had, in many cases, tried to resist that, they were not that fond of the southern states that have formed the Confederacy, because those were the states that had lobbied so hard and eventually so successfully to get rid of the five tribes from the South and take away their homelands. So these traditionalists did not necessarily feel, sort of a bond of affection or kinship with that culture. They also felt like they had signed a treaty with the United States, and even though the U.S. was notorious already by this point for not, honoring their treaties with indigenous peoples, these traditionalists believed, our word is our bond. We signed a treaty. We're going to abide by it, and our treaty is with the United States, and that is the Union. Slavery was also a factor. There were some mixed feelings about slavery. There were a lot of slave owners in the Cherokee and Creek nations, but at the same time, there was not among the traditionalists a fervent need to protect the institution of plantation slavery, because, and in fact, there were Cherokees who were abolitionists. Plantation slavery, race-based slavery, was not part of their tradition. It was something new. Therefore, they were less inclined to go along with it. So, for all these reasons, there was this range of opinion among the tribal citizens of the five tribes. However, it's the leadership of those tribes that Pike was there to see, and that the Confederacy wanted to make a deal with. So how is he going to approach that? What is he going to offer them to side with the Confederacy rather than with the Union? And it was very important that they do so. There was a desire not for their neutrality, but for their alliance with the Confederacy to help actually in the war effort as far as the fighting goes, as well as the fact, well, there were a couple of factors going on. For one thing, there in eastern Oklahoma, there's a lot of saltpeter, which is used to produce gunpowder. And that was just one of the resources that were there that could be taken advantage of by whichever of these two governments, the USA or the CSA, got the tribal leaders on their sides. It's estimated, or it was estimated by Confederate leaders, there was enough saltpeter in eastern Oklahoma to provide them enough gunpowder to last them the whole war. And another important thing was the strategic location of Indian Territory. It was sort of in a linchpin position, hooking together the East and the West, and the Confederacy did have designs on the American Southwest. They were hoping to make their presence known there, seize some territory there, hopefully, get some lands that could permanently be added to them. So, what is Pike going to do to get these leaders over on his side? It wasn't hard to get the Choctaws and the Chickasaws, their leadership. It wasn't hard to get them. What's he going to do with the others? Well, Pike had several things that he was willing to offer them, including, well, actually, he started with the argument for those who said that we have signed a treaty with the United States. He had a counter argument there. You signed a treaty with the United States, and now it's all broken up into pieces. So it's not, the same thing anymore. That's a bit of a stretch, maybe. But he also pointed out the abandonment of those forts and the withdrawal of federal forces. Remember, we talked about how that was something we were going to come back to. Well, that had been part of the removal treaty, that the U.S. government was going to put up these forts and keep them manned for the protection of the five tribes. Pike was able to say, hey, look, they've already violated the treaty. The treaty's broken now because they withdrew their troops. So there was that counter argument, but so far as the offers go, One thing that he offered was that the Confederate government would legally recognize the sovereignty of the 5 nations, which is something that the U.S. had not done, and to be honest, still to this day has not completely done. What does that mean, to recognize their legal sovereignty? That means that, let's say that the Confederacy had won, right? And they had this alliance with the 5 tribes. And let's say somebody from Texas comes into the Choctaw Nation and murders somebody. Let's say he murders a Choctaw. Well, the recognition of legal sovereignty means that under this Confederate deal, that white guy from Texas would be arrested by Choctaw authorities and tried in Choctaw courts and face Choctaw mandated punishment. Now, that's something the U.S. Certainly was not coming anywhere close to doing, and it really never did. Also, Pike promised them, if you ally with the Confederacy, there will be a seat, a representative seat for each of you on the Confederate Senate. So a seat, there'd be a Confederate senator from the Cherokee Nation, a Confederate senator from the Creek Nation, and so forth. Also something that hasn't been done by the United States. Also, the Confederate government offered to take over annuity payments that were being made by the U.S. government. So if there were goods or funds that the government had agreed, the U.S. government agreed by treaty to supply each year to these tribes, the Confederacy is going to step in and take over supplying that stuff. And then finally, Pike said, if you join with us, if you ally with us and raise an army for the Confederacy, the Confederate government will arm those regiments and equip them, and also offered to help train them. So that's quite a bit of stuff that was offered there by Pike. And it turned out Pike did not have the authority to make those offers. That had not been cleared with the Confederate government. When Confederate President Jefferson Davis heard about the terms that Pike had offered to these tribes, he went ballistic. He went through the roof. He was like, there is no way that we are going to grant all these things. However, the native leaders didn't know about that. And if things had played out in such a way the Confederacy had won, at the end of the war, the leaders of those tribes would no doubt have been maybe not surprised, but they would have been told, "Oh, oops, sorry, we didn't mean that." But it seemed like a good deal to them at the time. Therefore, most of them took it. Yes, no surprise, the Choctaws and Chickasaws signed on to ally with the Confederacy, but the Seminoles did too. Their leadership did, as did the Creeks, despite the fact that, in a couple of those cases, the tribal membership was not 100% behind this decision. However, the Cherokee Nation was a holdout. They were not very eager at all to take sides in this conflict, as represented by their principal chief, still John Ross. He wanted to remain neutral, not just because of conflicted feelings about which side was the better side or which cause was the better cause, but largely because of where the Cherokee Nation was located. Notice this on the map. Where are they located? The nation itself, northeastern Oklahoma, and then they've got that long strip there that is under their control. So basically all of this northern strip of Oklahoma. If all five tribes allied with the Confederacy and get involved in the fighting, well, where's the Yankees at? They're up there in Kansas, right across the border. Who's going to be the first of these five tribes to be invaded if they side with the Confederacy? It's going to be the Cherokees, who would have been the last, the Choctaws and Chickasaws. And oddly enough, they were the most gung-ho about being in the war. But Ross was not at all. So Albert Pike played the ace that he had hidden up his sleeve, an ace named Stand Watie. If you recall, Stand Watie was the nephew of Major Ridge and one of the leaders of the Ridge Party, of the Treaty Party. After the Treaty of New Echota had been signed and the Ridge Party and their followers had gone on out to Oklahoma, then later with the Trail of Tears, when the other Cherokees were brought there, remember there's a lot of fighting that took place, bitterness over how things had played out. Major Ridge and his son John were killed. Elias Boudinot, Stand Watie's younger brother, was killed, but Stand Watie survived the assassination attempt on him, or the execution attempt, might be a better way to put it, but he survived. And here he is now at this point, over 20 years later. He is still the primary opposition leader of John Ross and is very sympathetic to the Confederacy and the Confederate cause. In fact, just a few years before this, he had organized a chapter of the Knights of the Golden Circle, which is a secret society, sort of like a pre-Civil War Ku Klux Klan almost, devoted to trying to take away all kinds of territory from south of the border and add it to the United States so as to expand slavery. So, Pike's response to John Ross wanting to stay neutral and not wanting to sign this alliance treaty was, well, if you won't sign it, I know somebody that will. Stand Watie, and we will recognize him as the true and official leader, principal chief of the Cherokee people. Now, Ross knew that if that happened, then the Cherokee Civil War that had raged throughout the 1840s and had finally been brought to a conclusion and peace had settled over the land among the combatants, well, there were still plenty of hurt feelings. If this happened, Ross knew that that Civil War would start back up, that there would be fighting between Cherokees. Therefore, Ross offered a compromise, the compromise being authorizing a referendum vote of the citizens of the Cherokee Nation as to whether or not to ally with the Confederacy. So that vote was taken, and it was not an overwhelming vote, but the pro-Confederate side did win that vote. Therefore, Ross kept his word, and signed the treaty with Albert Pike, making the Cherokees allies of the Confederacy, along with the other four members of the five civilized tribes. So that even though there remained a range of opinion among the citizens of the tribes, the official tribal governments, the leaders of all five civilized tribes, were now allied with the Confederacy by the end of December 1861. And immediately, Native American Confederate units started to be raised, and true to his word, Pike initiated the process of training those troops. And before long, you had Confederate Indians in gray in Indian Territory. Confederate Creek and Seminole forces tended to combine, as did the Choctaw and Chickasaw forces, with the less populous representatives of the Seminole Nation joining in with the Creeks, and same thing with the Chickasaws joining in with the Choctaws. So here are a couple of the principal Confederate top officers at the beginning of the war. Two brothers, Daniel and Chili McIntosh. Actually, Daniel was the youngest McIntosh brother. They were the sons of William McIntosh, the Creek leader who had signed the Treaty of Indian Springs in 1825 that triggered Indian removal for the Creeks, and who was killed for that. One of the people leading the group that killed him back in 1825 may have been Opothleyahola, whom we will meet in a little bit. Both these McIntosh brothers, by the way, signed the treaty allying the Creek Nation with the Confederacy. One of the top leaders of the Confederate Choctaws was Jackson McCurtain, who about 20 years later would be principal chief of the Choctaw Nation. McCurtain was a colonel, by the way, as were the two McIntosh brothers that we just talked about. And here we have an actual photograph taken during the Civil War of some Confederate Choctaws. And here we see the flag of the 1st Cherokee Mounted Rifles, which was one of several Cherokee regiments raised during the war. Initially, the 1st Cherokee Mounted Rifles was commanded by John Drew, and Stand Watie was the initial commander of the 2nd Cherokee Mounted Rifles. He later took over the 1st as well. You'll notice that the Cherokee Confederate flag is based very closely on the Confederate flag. That is the first flag of the Confederate States of America, which you can see here, which had 7 stars, the Stars and Bars, it was called, the Confederate flag. 7 stars because the last 4 states had not yet seceded, which they had by the time the 1st Cherokee Mounted Rifles had their flag designed. So on their flag, you have 11 white stars on the Cherokee flag for the 11 Confederate states, and in the middle, 5 red stars for the 5 civilized tribes. 1 star in the middle is bigger than the others. I bet you can guess which of the tribes that's supposed to be. Obviously, it's the Cherokees. Eventually, all the regiments and battalions of the various 5 civilized tribes, Confederate troops, were all pulled together into one brigade. And that brigade was commanded by Stand Watie, making him a brigadier general, or 1-star general, and making him the only Native American general in the Confederate Army. However, he was not the only Native American general in the Civil War. There was also a Native American brigadier general in the Union Army, Ely Parker, who was Iroquois, specifically Seneca. Parker was on the staff of General Grant, and in fact, when Grant became president, he appointed Parker as the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, the first time that a Native American Indian had served in that capacity, and then the last time that would happen for another 100 years. Anyhow, there were, in fact, 2 brigadier generals who were Native American in the Civil War, one on each side. Now we're going to talk about this guy, a Creek leader named Opothleyahola. Now, this is a painting of him as a young man, probably around the time of the Creek War of 1813, in which Opothleyahola was one of the leaders of the Red Stick Creeks who fought against the United States. By the beginning of the Civil War, Opothleyahola was in his late 70s or early 80s and may have looked more like his fellow National Creek Council member Hothlepoya, alias Manawa, pictured here. We don't have any images of Opothleyahola from that time period, so we don't know for sure. Bear in mind, though, that Opothleyahola, along with Manawa, may well have led the group of Creek warriors who had killed William McIntosh in 1825 for signing the treaty that led to Creek removal. And remember that William McIntosh was the father of Chili and Daniel McIntosh, who by this time, the beginning of the Civil War, are essentially the military leaders of the Creek Confederate regiments. Opothleyahola, very much a traditionalist, was deeply opposed to the Creek Nation allying with the Confederacy and was in favor instead of remaining loyal to the United States. He was also deeply disappointed in his Cherokee friend John Ross for knuckling under and signing a treaty of alliance with the Confederate States of America. Now, interestingly, Opothleyahola and John Ross had been on opposite sides in the Creek War. The Cherokees had fought on the side of the U.S. in that one, but they had grown to become friends and to respect one another quite a bit because they wanted a lot of the same things for their people. And now Ross has finally brought the Cherokees in, the final of the fifth civilized tribes. And Opothleyahola was unhappy about that whole situation. And in fact, just about 2 weeks after the Cherokee referendum led to John Ross signing that treaty, Opothleyahola contacted President Abraham Lincoln requesting protection for himself and his followers, feeling very uneasy and unsafe as he now, being loyal to the Union, was essentially surrounded by Confederate Indians. And he was told by President Lincoln that if he and his people would travel northward across the Kansas border, Kansas, of course, being a Union state, and report to Fort Row, Kansas, that his people would be provided for and given protection. So Opothleyahola started making preparations for just such a journey. In the meanwhile, however, the number of people in his camp continued to grow. So initially, he had quite a few Creek Indians who were loyal to the Union and loyal to him, who were there with him. More of them came and joined his group, but also a large number of Seminoles who were opposed to the Confederacy came and joined his group. And so did some Cherokees who were unhappy. Remember, almost half of the Cherokees had voted against siding with the Confederacy. And even some Choctaws and Chickasaws who were opposed to the Confederacy came and joined his group. And also large numbers of free black individuals living in the nations came and joined to his group. And a significant number of African slaves ran away from their masters and made their way to the camp of Opothleyahola to join his group. Imagine that, slaves and free blacks being more in favor of the Union than the Confederacy. Anyhow, this is an interesting development because Opothleyahola himself owned slaves. However, his view toward slaves and slavery was the traditionalist view, which was similar to the old kinship slavery arrangement. So anyhow, by mid-November, there were 9,000 people in the camp of Opothleyahola. Now, the Confederate authorities, meaning both the military authorities of the five tribes and of the Confederacy itself, were very uncomfortable with the idea of 9,000 pro-Union Native American Indians making their way behind Union lines where they could potentially, lend their support physically to the war. So they weren't going to let them leave. But leave they did. In mid-November, they set out from Eufaula, headed northward. The Confederate forces, including I think about half a regiment of Texas Rangers, along with the various Confederate regiments from the five tribes, made it a point, made it their mission to prevent them from leaving. And so they found themselves, as they were headed northward, they found themselves being harassed and eventually attacked by Confederate forces. Now, these are 9,000 people on this trek, many of them women and children and older people. And it started mid-November. It took them the better part of 6 weeks to make this journey with old people and women and children. So most of the traveling was done in December, which pretty cold month. Heavy snowfall and in fact near blizzard conditions for much of the journey. And that journey was in fact a running fight with three full-scale battles between the Confederate forces that were pursuing them and the men of fighting age among those who were traveling with Opothleyahola. First, a really big battle at Round Mountain. They drove the Confederates back at Round Mountain, but then suffered a tactical defeat at Chustotalasa, or Caving Bank. Opothleahola's forces then suffered a crushing defeat at Chustanala along Bird Creek. But they did finally successfully cross the Kansas border and then headed eastward to Fort Row. However, they had lost about 2,000 people, and that includes fighting men, but also women and children and elderly people. One interesting and noteworthy event that took place during that running battle, near the beginning of it, is that when John Drew's first Mounted Cherokee Regiment was ordered to fire on Opothleahola's people and learned that there were some Cherokees among Opothleahola's people, they refused to do it. Almost all of them deserted. Quite a few. And at that point, Stand Waty's second Cherokee mounted rifles were brought in as reinforcements and absorbed what little was left of the 1st Regiment. Meanwhile, the suffering of Opothleahola's people was not over because there was a problem when they arrived at Fort Row. When the U.S. government had invited Opothleyahola to come there and offered to give them shelter, they did not know that he would be leaving with almost 9,000 people. After having lost more than 2,000, so there's still more than 6,000, between 6 and 7,000 people showed up at the fort, and there simply was not room to accommodate them inside the fort, so they were forced to camp out in the open outside of the fort in a blizzard, and many more died, including Opothleahola's daughter. So the whole experience was one that deeply, deeply embittered many of the people who had gone with Opothleyahola, embittered them against the Confederacy even more, and particularly against Confederates from within the 5 civilized tribes who had essentially caused them to lose so many people. I mean, it's very likely that every family that set out on this journey lost at least one person, either in battle from being directly killed, or from exposure along the way in this weeks long journey through the snow, or of starvation or exposure or freezing to death once they got there. So in a way, the Confederate Indians had caused the very result that they had been trying to prevent, which was the service of those anti-Confederate, pro-Union members of the 5 tribes in the Union Army, because once they got to Kansas, many of the fighting age men who had been part of Opothleahola's forces and who had probably lost family members joined the Union Army. In fact, there was a Native American regiment created there in Kansas called the Indian Home Guard that included members of all 5 of the tribes. And in addition to that, many of the runaway slaves and free blacks who had been part of that exodus, they joined up with one of the all-black Kansas Union regiments. So now you've got a lot of very angry people. And you've also got members of the 5 civilized tribes now serving in uniform on both sides of the Civil War, and it has become also an Indian Civil War. Just 2 months later, Native American regiments on both sides are going to be involved in the Battle of Pea Ridge, Arkansas, also known as the Battle of Elkhorn Tavern, which was the largest Civil War battle to be fought west of the Mississippi River. As you can see, that battle took place not far from the borders of the Cherokee Nation. The Union won a resounding victory at Pea Ridge, and Confederate General Ben McCulloch, the famous Texas Ranger, was killed in this battle. General Albert Pike survived, but did not perform well as a battlefield commander. In short order, the Union Army crossed the border into the Cherokee Nation and attacked the Cherokee capital of Tahlequah, which they took. So among those Union forces were probably quite a few pro-Union Cherokees, a large number of people, Cherokees and others who had been part of the flight of Opothleyahola, returning now to the Indian Territory under very different circumstances. John Ross surrendered to the Union shortly after the fall of the Cherokee capital. He surrendered and changed sides to the Union, and not long afterward, they abolished slavery in the Cherokee Nation. Ross would spend the rest of the war in Washington, D.C., lobbying on behalf of his people. However, the Confederate government and the Confederate Army did not recognize Ross's new government, and instead they dealt with Stand Watie as the quote-unquote principal chief of the Cherokee Nation. So there were essentially two Cherokee governments, one Union and one Confederate, operating for the rest of the war. Quite a bit more fighting took place. John Ross's biggest fear, remember, the reason he had wanted to remain neutral, was that if the Cherokees got into the fight, they'd be the first ones in Indian Territory to suffer, and in fact, they were. There was also quite a bit of fighting in the Creek Nation, and there's a lot of guerrilla activity going on during the war. Things got really bad in Indian Territory. Another significant battle to talk about in the region was the Battle of Honey Springs on July 17, 1863, which was the largest Civil War battle to be fought in what would become the state of Oklahoma. Also, the only major battle in the Civil War in which the majority of soldiers on both sides were Native American. Spoiler alert, the Confederacy lost the Civil War ultimately in April of 1865, and the Confederate allied governments of all the five tribes had to sign a treaty with the United States, ending the conflict, separate from the surrender of the Confederacy. So these were the treaties of 1866 with each of the five tribes. Stand Watie is probably most famous, other than for being a Cherokee general. He's also famous for being the last Confederate general to surrender, and he was memorialized as such, for example, in this postage stamp, I think in the 1990s. Now, there's a reason for that. Because the five tribes were not members of the Confederacy, they were allied to the Confederacy. Like I said, just because the Confederacy surrendered didn't mean that they did, and they had to do so separately. That's why he wound up being the last general to surrender. I mentioned earlier that things got pretty rough in Indian Territory during the Civil War. Now, most people today don't even realize that there were Native American soldiers in uniform in the Civil War. And even those who know that probably don't realize just how destructive this war was in Indian Territory. At the end of the war, 1 out of every 3 Cherokee women had been widowed. 1 out of every 4 Cherokee children were orphans, that is, with no parents. 1/3 of all Cherokees, Creeks, and Seminoles were dead at the end of this war. The Choctaws and the Chickasaws fared a little bit better because none of those major battles that we just talked about took place in the Choctaw or Chickasaw nation. Choctaw and Chickasaw soldiers were killed, but there was not that destruction within their territory that there was in the other tribes, which is kind of ironic because it was the Choctaws and Chickasaws who had been most pro-Confederate. So altogether, when you look at just the Union side, the number of pro-Union Native Americans in Indian Territory who were killed during the Civil War, relevant to population, was a higher percentage than in any northern state. So a higher percentage of Union supporters were killed in Indian Territory than in from New York or Pennsylvania. Now more people were killed, more troops were killed from New York and Pennsylvania because they had really high populations. But as a percentage of the population, the the Indian Territory had it worse, and they were just as bad off, and in many cases worse off, than any of the southern states so far as the Confederacy was concerned. Once the war was over, there was a lot of lawlessness in the area. Life continued to be dangerous for quite a while afterward, especially for people of African descent. So that includes former slaves. As a result of those treaties, the five civilized tribes, in order to make peace with the U.S., had to free their slaves and make them citizens of their tribal nations. And this led to a backlash against what were called the freedmen, which were men, women, and children who were black that lived in Indian Territory. Many of them were murdered. It was very similar to the situation during the early part of Reconstruction in the southern states. So overall, really, really highly destructive. And it wasn't only the physical destruction and death and suffering that was going to be a factor going forward. As a result of the Treaty of 1866 with each of the tribes, and as punishment for their having allied with the Confederacy, they lost about half their territory in Oklahoma. Essentially, the whole western half of what is now Oklahoma was taken from them and now belong to the federal government. Later, the federal government would use that area to put various tribes that were conquered and defeated in the 1870s and 80s to remove them there. The magenta line that you see there, that is the new boundary of Indian Territory. So from this point forward, Indian Territory is really going to be the territory of the five civilized tribes. And later in the 1880s, the whole region was divided officially, making the western part Oklahoma Territory and not Indian Territory. Finally, as a result of the 1866 treaties, all of Indian Territory was put under the jurisdiction of the Federal District Court in Fort Smith, Arkansas. Now, the individual five tribes, they're still going to have their own court system and their own police forces. So far as what they're able to do jurisdictionally with their own people, but non-Indians who are in the area are going to be under the jurisdiction of the court in Fort Smith, and so will be essentially Indians who kill white people or rob white people. So anything that involves just Indians, the five tribes are going to be allowed to take care of, but anything else, the court in Fort Smith is going to have jurisdiction, and the U.S. Marshal Service operating out of Fort Smith. And that is going to have major repercussions for the whole region that we will be getting into later.